I need to preface this Devar Torah by saying that this was not easy for me to write. I spent much longer writing and rewriting than I normally do. Not because I couldn't think of what to say, but because I had too much to say. Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is anomalous in the fact that it commands the same rest and celebration of every other Shabbat, but also requires the introspection and the thoughtfulness of the days of awe. Because of this, it is a complicated day, a day that tests me theologically more so than any other day of the year. So the words I want to share with you this day reflect that theological struggle. And I hope that anyone who is moved to do so sets up a time to meet and talk about these questions and these proposals, because I believe that they are important for who we are as Jews and for who we are as human beings. There's a story of a man who goes to see his rabbi during the intermediary days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The man is exhausted. He looks like he hasn't slept in days. And there's a clear and troubled anguish written on his face. The rabbi, concerned, hurries him in, sits him down, and prepares him a cup of coffee. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Rabbi," the man says. "I know that these are the days of awe, and you are so busy with everything that you have to prepare, but I just need to talk to you." The rabbi assures the man that he is never too busy to hear the concerns of one of his congregants, and asks him to tell him what's on his mind. The man explains, "These high holy days have been far too challenging. I've done my best to be a good and righteous Jew, but my thoughts have been unfair and unjust. I've said the vidui. Every day I beat my chest and I ask God to forgive me. But I can't help but think that that itself is unjust. You see, I'm a simple man, and this past year I have sinned, yes, but my transgressions have been small and quickly forgiven. When I speak to God, though, I can't bite my tongue. I say to him, 'How about you? When are you going to ask to be forgiven? This year you have been responsible for horrendous acts of cruelty and pain. You have taken mothers away from their babies and babies away from their mothers.' And then I say to him, 'How about if you forgive me, I'll forgive you, and we can call it even?' The rabbi looks at the man with tears in his eyes and says, 'Why did you let God off the hook so easily? With that argument, you could have redeemed all of Israel.' Why do we let God off the hook? What a charged and awkward question to wrestle with during these Yamim Noraim. My build-up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur has had me wrestling with the same theological question. And like the sleepless man in the story, it has also made me feel incredibly guilty and embarrassed. While this year has been filled with countless personal blessings, I cannot ignore the unspeakable violence, hatred, and evil that has crashed against this world like a pounding tsunami these last months. My first few weeks here at Shaarey Zedek were packed with funerals and shivas. In my first 2 months, I got to know the daily minyan goers and the Friday night service goers, and I got to know them on a very personal level because I had to address terror attack after terror attack, tragedy after tragedy, airports exploding, nightclubs being littered with bullets, police officers being sniped from office towers, and unarmed men being killed by those who pledged to protect them. And I find myself asking God, when are you going to say you're sorry? When are you going to pound your holy chest and do a vidui of your own? And it saddens me to think this way because as a rabbi, I sometimes feel that I should be steadfast in my theology, that I should live my life with the unwavering joy of the Hasidim or the unbreakable faith of the Haredim. But when I'm being my truest self, I know that I have an obligation to myself, to all of you, and to God to let my heart break when the Torah I love hurts me with words I cannot agree with, to get angry when I see innocent men, women, and children suffering, and evil and hateful people thriving, and to cry out to God with the question, where are you? When friends, family, congregants, people so close and dear to me struggle with illness, with disease, with loss, and with grief. I have to wrestle with God after every hospital visit where I hold the hand of one of our members and tell them that I'm thinking about them and keeping them in my prayers. I have to wrestle with God when I say the words of our liturgy at a Shiva minyan, for a man, a woman, or a child who is taken too soon and needlessly from this world, leaving family and friends with a hole in their heart that can never fully be filled. And I have to wrestle with God when I read the Torah on this Shabbat called Shuvah, the Shabbat of repentance, the Shabbat of return, when the usual peace and rest of this beautiful day is asked to be observed alongside words that force us to propose that painful question, where are you? In our Torah reading, Moses addresses the Israelites and speaks to them of the beauty of the land they are about to inherit, a land flowing with milk and honey, where God will watch over them and protect them. But God also speaks to Moses and says that things will not be so easy, because the people will sin, and when they do, God will hide himself from them. When they call out and when they plead, God will not answer. God will take offense to the actions of his people, and when they need him most, God will turn his back. I can't, in good faith, try to explain the words of this parasha with any theology that would sit comfortably with me as a rabbi or with me as a Jew. I'm not sure if God's words here are supposed to be comforting to those of us who read them today during these days of Shuvah, that maybe even if God is hidden, he still hears our cries, but I know that they make me feel lonely when I need God most. What's painful here is that hiddenness doesn't feel passive. It feels personal. It feels like neglect or like abandonment, because every day I hear God's name evoked, but so often in ways that are foreign to my understanding of God and God's presence in our lives. So I wonder to myself if God has hidden himself, but only to those that need him. Those who use that sacred name, who claim their closeness to him in our day and age, often do so in order to justify an act or belief that is so terribly ungodlike. When a suicide bomber screams Allahu Akbar, God is great, before detonating themselves with the hopes of killing civilians. When fundamentalists of any faith use God's name to reinforce intolerance, misogyny, or bigotry. And when politicians around the world use God's name to push an agenda that cripples schools and neglects the poor, or to simply secure votes from those who cling to that name, I hear the name. I hear it loud and clear. But no matter how hard I look, I don't see the God that I believe in. In a world so filled with God's name, God's presence can feel so profoundly absent at times. And my fear is that we have started to believe that the zealots and the fundamentalists are justified in their calls of spiritual ascension, that their claimed knowledge of God's will is valid in some way, and that our response has become to reject God while we reject those who profane his name. We have been taught to think that God is everywhere. And if God is everywhere, surely he is in the horrors of our lives as well. And those horrors are deafening. They often feel so much louder than the whispers of peace and compassion. But I want us to rethink that theology, because I believe that it is nuanced, that it requires us to do that wrestling that we're supposed to do during these 10 days of awe that can be so painful and alienating. When we quote the great Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who said, "Where is God? Wherever we let him in." Do we understand that without any discomfort, without any hesitancy? Can we really sign off on a statement so filled with complications? Because you will never, ever hear me from this bima tell you that God is in the cry of a suicide bomber, that God is in the rejection of human beings based on sex, creed, orientation, or the color of their skin, that God is in the cancer that attacks our loved ones' muscles and bones. I can't say it. I cannot believe that the God of Israel, the God who cares for the widows and orphans, who gives voice to the prophets to raise the poor and the meek from the dust of society, who etches into the stone of history the word Zedek, Zedek Tirdov, justice, justice you shall pursue, can simultaneously be the God of sickness and disease, of racism, of violence, and of hate. That is a dissonance that, despite the adding of notes and chords, melodies and tones, cannot bring the music of existence into harmony. So then, God, where are you? On this Shabbat Shuvah, I want to suggest that we interpret this hiddenness that we're talking about. That we do what Jews have always done and spend time wrestling with our text, our faith, and our tradition, and to challenge ourselves to find God even when it seems that God is painfully absent. I want to suggest that God is in the places we have taken for granted, or maybe where we have forgotten to look in the first place. Places that we have ignored because they aren't announced with the dramatics and the pomp and the exclamation marks that we have become so used to. That on the Shabbat of rest and celebration and difficult but sincere wrestling, we can have the courage to continue to use the divine name in the manner for which it was intended. That when an act of terror takes place, we use God's name in the compassion of the first responders, in the urgency of doctors, nurses, social workers, and therapists who work tirelessly to save human life and dignity. That when illness and disease bruise and batter our families, we use God's name to embrace the comfort provided by family and friends. And we trust that God does not deliver the sickness, but suffers and cries by our side, brokenhearted by our pain and by our despair. That when we hear the verses and psalms sung so beautifully by our assistant cantor and chazan, we hear the God of mercy and compassion in the chanting, that we may elevate our hearts, and like the sleepless man of the story, ask God for forgiveness while pleading for some explanations of our own. And in so doing, may we muffle the hatred and vitriol that comes with the profanation of God's name. May we, please God, in our day hear the words of Allahu Akbar and immediately assume the birth of a child or an announcement of peace. May we in our day hear God's name evoked by politicians not for votes or popularity, but for the defense of the poor and the oppressed, for those who have been cast aside, for those who have grown accustomed to being ignored. May we hear God's name and respond viscerally with warmth and joy, rather than with nervousness and embarrassment. And may we, in our moments of doubt and anger, recognize that those feelings are okay, that they are inherent emotions of love and partnership. But my prayer for all of us is that no matter how much we hurt, how angry or how frustrated we are, we never stop searching, no matter how hidden God's presence may feel. And if we do truly feel abandoned, that we don't let God off the hook, because love requires accountability. On this day of return and these days of awe, may we find God in the places where we often fail to look. May we meet one another at the gates of redemption. May we each say that we're sorry with honesty and with sincerity. And may our partnership be renewed with love and with blessings. Shabbat Shalom and Gemar Chatima Tova.